In emergency management, the definition of a stakeholder is any person or entity with a vested interest in the survival or recovery of a given community.
This is the Stakeholder Prepping podcast, where the tactical comes from the practical, and today, you become your own stakeholder.
Here are your hosts, Chris and AC.
Welcome back to Stakeholder Prepping, where you, yes, you, are the stakeholder in your own survival, where we turn real-world threats, everyday environments, and long-term resilience into practical actions that you can take right now. And AC, I'm super excited for today's episode.
Yeah, today we have a special guest with us. Nathan Dickinson, he's an online preparedness personality who has done a ton of very informative short videos across all of the socials. And for some reason, I don't know, that algorithm it just thinks it wants to feed me his pretty face all day. Like I just constantly see Nathan videos all the time. But he is a fellow podcaster like us, and he recently released a book about trees and regional foliage and kind of the natural uses and resources within wood. And I think that's really exciting. So we're gonna uh, we're gonna dive into that. But we're talking about firewood foraging, natural medicinals, shelter materials, land management, the whole thing. So Nathan, thanks very much for coming on and joining us.
Yeah, thank you.
So, Nathan, our audience may or may not know you or be familiar with you like we are. Can you give us kind of the 5-minute Nathan Dickinson bio and explain to us a little bit about what you do and why we're talking to you about trees today?
Yep. So overall, I'm kind of working goal is to help teach people how to become more self-sufficient and be prepared for emergencies. So in the social media aspect, I will talk about everything from useful trees for homesteading, which is the name of my book, to food storage for emergency preparedness, to off-grid technologies. And they're all kind of different subjects, but they're all closely related. And so um, I will talk about those different things in terms in the goal of trying to get people to be more self-reliant and have a more kind of secure lifestyle. And so how I got started in that was one, as a kid, I always just wanted to live in the forest. And so,
We join the club, yeah. Hang a big no girls sign outside and move in.
yep. Yeah, no girls. I'm actually getting married here soon, so I guess there'll be a girl.
You gotta
Congratulations.
take sign down.
But yeah, I just wanted to live in the woods. And so that presented a little bit of a problem because I also really like video games. And so I like technology. And I can't just have a shack with no power. So how do I do power? Well, solar panels are pretty cool. In fact, the whole off grid energy systems have come a long ways just in the last decade. And so I got really into studying alternative technologies. I also grew up poor, so I couldn't do any of these big fancy off-grid systems that are like, yeah, we have built this nice big solar array for $20,000. And I was like, yeah, I don't think I can do that one. So I would research alternative technologies. Like, for instance, a rocket mass heater is basically it's a masonry heater that will use a fraction of the wood to heat your house, and you only have to have a fire lit for an hour, so it's safe every couple of days because it holds that heat and it just slowly radiates out into it. Well, that slowly spread into what I call the Zion Home Project, and that's where a lot of my videos are focused on. And it's basically I'm building an off-grid house that is trying to be as affordable as possible because I don't have a lot of extra money to build something fancy, but also present a 21st century lifestyle for that. And as part of that overall project is where the useful trees for homesteading comes into play because I've always really liked trees. So I got really obsessed with studying what trees do what. Like, for instance, there's a tree called the black locust. It's my favorite tree. It's the first tree I talk about in my book. The wood does not rot. It takes 100 years for the wood to rot in the ground. And so old time farmers would use black locust as fence posts. And so you put this fence post in the ground, it doesn't rot, and you just string your barbed wire and it works great. And so just little things like that that are some of them are technology related, some of them are plant related, but all of them are overall in that goal of just being able to live in the woods and have a nice, relaxing life, a nice, slow life, and just utilizing all the different materials around me to make that possible as affordably as possible.
Nice.
That's really exciting. So what your educational background? Did you have any formal education in any of this stuff? Or are you 100% self-taught? I mean, where did that knowledge come from?
So I am pretty much 100% self-taught. My formal education background is in HVAC and mechatronics. HVAC is just heating and air conditioning, and then mechatronics is just industrial maintenance. And so I know how to make machines work good and how to um, climate control a building, which has been useful for designing some of the more off-grid stuff because climate control is one of the biggest energy hogs out there. And so being able to do random weird things just because I know the science behind it has been useful. And so that was my formal education. And then everything else has just been basically what do I want to hyperfixate and research on this week? There was one week where I spent an entire week on just cheese.
So so these shorts, how did that come about? When did you decide, "Hey, I'm gonna get a couple 100,000 social media followers and make little short videos about preparedness?" I mean, it seems like you've been doing this a while. I mean, we would kill to have half your followers, so I just kind of
Right.
wonder, yeah, how all that came about and how you were so successful in such a short amount of time.
So I've been doing the videos for probably about 5 years now. And before that, had a podcast. But there actually was a big transition. So originally, I always thought that the building the off grid, buying the land, because land's really expensive, would be a decade down the road. And so another one of my passions was personal development and success. And so my original podcast was called The Principles of Success. It's ended now. I ended it a few years ago. But I would talk about things like action and hard work. And then I had what I called the attributes of success, which was basically the things that you want that make up a successful life. Like, for instance, being happy or having health or good relationships. And then, of course, money. And so originally, I started talking about that. That's a very saturated market. I did not do very good. But I was very diligent. So I put out a ton of videos, I put out a ton of podcast episodes, and I slowly became a little bit better at talking to a camera. And so eventually, I also had this other interest that I would occasionally talk about, which was homesteading stuff or off grid technologies. And every once in a while, I would slip one of those videos in, and the algorithm really liked those videos. I remember very clearly I did a success video and it got like 200 views, and then the next day I did a homestead video and that was my first super viral one, and I got 1 million views, and I was like, okay, I think people
Whoa!
are more interested in this subject than the success one. So I slowly
That's
started to make that pivot.
epic.
Yeah, it was pretty
That's
good. It's actually
epic.
on it actually was my first Zion Home video that I remember putting out because I had just finished my diagram of my house of all the different technologies and how they would play into each other. And so I made a video talking about that, and I guess people really liked the concept. So at that point I realized that okay, I probably should start slowly shifting from talking about just general success to talking about self-reliance because both are my passion, but one a lot more people are interested in hearing. And so
Yeah,
that's kind of how I
so
got started.
preppers get, more views than Tony Robbins any day of the week. I like it.
I'm digging it. So I do want to ask about trees, and I know you've got one book out. Is there a second book coming out about trees?
So the Useful Trees is the book that I wrote, and it is basically all that I was planning on doing in terms of trees. Each chapter it covers a different subject matter for the most part. Like for instance, the first chapter is just my favorite trees. Like, all right, here's the top 10 trees. These were the most useful in my opinion. You should probably all get them. Here you go. And then the last several chapters are like, all right, if you live in a really, really cold environment, here's all the useful trees for that environment. you live in the desert, here are all the useful trees for that. And so basically was just trying to cover a quick overview of each type of tree for whatever situation you find yourself in terms of trying to be more self-reliant. And so that's kind of what I was doing with that book. The next book would be the probably my Zion book and talk about the house design stuff and just
Okay.
the overall systems.
So, for the average person who can only identify maybe 2 or 3 different tree species, like the rest of us plebs, what are the top 5 trees that they should learn first and why?
So that really kind of depends on your area because a desert tree is not going to be growing in northwest or the northeast or the southeast. And so the best thing overall, and I'm going to answer this question in two different ways, this one and then a different way. The best thing overall is just ask ChatGPT for what most useful trees in this region, and it'll start popping them up, and then you can learn what those trees look like in your area. In fact, I was actually just recently in Phoenix, Arizona. I've never been to Arizona since I was a little kid. And I was just walking around and I was like, hey, wait a second. That's a Palo Verde, which is a just a green tree. The bark is green. And so that's how I recognized it. I was like, wait a second. I know what that tree is. I've never seen it in person, but I know what that tree is because it's all over the place. It's a pretty tree that they plant ornamentally. That one's actually not that useful. I do talk about it in my book, but overall, it's not one of my favorite trees. But yeah, just learn the trees in your area. And then I actually would recommend my book because if you look at the trees in your area, my book lists what trees are most useful. And then just go to Google and look up what those trees look like and learn those trees. So that was the first way that I was going to answer the question. The second way is what overall I would say is the most general trees that you could plant that would be useful for homesteading in general. Typically, you want some sort of firewood tree. A lot of the best firewood trees are in the legume family, so they grow really fast, but still have a good amount of burning potential. So some of my favorites would be honey locust, which is related to black locust, which we talked about earlier. Honey locust burns really hot, grows really fast, and unlike locust, doesn't have a lot of thorns, at least the tamed variety.
Okay.
Osage orange is also a very popular firewood tree. It burns really hot. It's also one of the hardest trees in the world. And so that's a good firewood tree. So again, for your area, look up what would be really good firewood wood trees for your area. So you want a firewood tree. Then of course, you also want a good emergency food tree. These aren't trees that you would necessarily plant, but if they're in your area, they're probably abundant and you can access them. So for my area and a lot of people's areas, it would be pine. Pine is not something you
Sure.
typically want to eat. It kind of is gross. But thousands of people across the globe have used pine to survive in times of famine. So pine bark, the inner cambium layer, which is so you have the outside layer, which is hard, and then you have wood. There's a soft, spongy layer of bark in between those two layers that, if you peel off, is edible and it has calories. It tastes strongly of pine. If you've ever used pine sol, you kind of probably know what pine smells and tastes like, and it's not very tasty. But it does have calories, and so people would make pine bark bread to survive during times of famine, pretty much anywhere in the extreme northern hemisphere where there's lots of pine trees. Another really good one is hickory. So hickory nuts are extremely edible. They also have a shell that's about 4 times as hard to crack. I'm making up the 4 times. 4 times as hard to crack as a walnut. It's just a really thick shell, and then the nut just shatters. So commercially, we don't eat them. They're a pain in the butt to crack, and you don't want to mess with that. So historically, what the local tribes would do is instead of breaking up the nuts to eat the nuts, they would just smash everything together, nut and shell, and then boil it in a pot to make a broth, and then just drink the broth as a way to get some calories. So
Interesting.
in your local area, look up what survival trees people utilized to not starve to death during times of famine. So, wood trees, survival trees. Of course, you're going to want some fruit trees. The most general would be apple. Everybody loves apple. It's not the greatest fruit in the world. Everyone has a fruit that they probably like better than apple, but it stores really well. It's really easy to harvest. It grows in most locations. So, apple's a really good one. One of the ones that you might not have ever heard of that is an extremely useful fruit tree. In fact, it's one of my top favorite trees is mulberry. So mulberry is a fast-growing tree that burns really well and has mulberry fruit. And they're kind of like blackberries. But the reason why you probably might not have ever heard of them is because they are super, super squishy blackberries. And so you can't transport them. And so you have to basically eat them off of the tree or pick them from the tree and take them inside and not stick them in a car to have rattled around, and they'll never make it to the grocery store. And they go bad fairly quickly. So you have to make them into jams or stuff, or you can eat them that day. But the fruit is like a blackberry, it just grows on a tree. And then the wood is extremely useful. And so there's all sorts of just random fruit trees that are good fruits but aren't good supermarket fruits. And so if you want some more variety to your fruits, because it would be really nice if you could have fruit from the beginning of fruit season all the way to the end. And if you only are picking a couple of different fruits, then you're only going to have a season where you have a ton of fruit. But if you use something like, so this isn't a tree, it's called a hascap, and it's a bush, but it's kind of like a blueberry bush, but it produces the berries in March, so very early in the year. And then all the way at the end, you could do something like, if you're down south, you could do something like pomegranates, which are a November fruit. And so you only have a couple of months there where you're not actively growing and producing fruit. And at which point, that's where apples come in handy because you can store them. Or I really like canned pears. I don't like fresh pears, but I like canned pears. So you can can the pears and store them for those couple of months where you're not actively producing fruit. So fruit trees would be another one. Nut trees go along in that category. Nuts are a great source of protein and fats, especially. And the nice thing about trees is they're in the context of prepping. You get them in the ground, they grow up, they mature. Let's say a horde of zombies come through and kill all your animals. If you don't have a way to produce any proteins or fats besides animals, well, then you might be in trouble. But if you have some nut trees, you can, even if your livestock took a big hit or you had a famine or a disease that swept through your herd, while you're waiting for your herd to build up, if you got some new animals from your neighbors, you can survive off of the fruit and nuts.
That's a good call. I
So,
like that. Now, unfortunately, I'm in the Pacific Northwest, so we have a lot of vegan zombies, so it doesn't help us out a ton, but I have a pine question actually for you because you're right, pine is everywhere, right? And there's a bunch of different kinds of pine. I've never personally seen a pine nut. Is a pine nut of a certain kind of pine or like, I'm like the firs and pines we have around here. I just have never seen one. Is there particular trees that have pine nuts and certain pines that don't?
You're talking about the ones that are like in fancy salads, right?
Yeah, yeah, the fancy salad nut.
so in general, the specific pine nuts that you get in fancy salads come from a specific type of pine. I don't remember what type off the top of my head, but that's because it's just the one with the biggest nuts and easiest to harvest in a location where labor is cheap. I believe it's over in Asia. But if you've seen a pine cones have pine nuts. The reason
Really?
why nobody harvests pine nuts, and if you look at historical books, people would eat pine nuts that they harvested locally, but pine nuts are tiny, and getting them out of pine cones is a pain in the butt because you have to pick the pine cone when it's green and still in the tree. And
Oh.
pine trees don't typically have a lot of good climbing limbs down where you can easily reach and it is safe. And so pine nuts on a homestead aspect can happen, but typically most people won't bother because it's just not worth the danger and the headache of trying to get all these teeny tiny pine nuts out of the pine cones that are clear up 3 stories high.
Interesting. Okay, that's really interesting. See, I learned something. Look at that. Personally, me, I'm a big walnut fan, and I'm going to relate this to one of your videos I watched where you were talking about kind of there's no reason to not feed people, where it's like you can go buy 4 bags of any old grain and have enough to feed 50 people for a week or something. I may be paraphrasing you, but that was kind of the gist of it. And we recently did an urban foraging episode where we talked about walnuts. And I did the math, kind of like the way you do the math. And a fully mature walnut tree can produce like 1 million calories a year. And I get that it's not the perfect, blend of all the nutrients that you need. But just as far as like to your point, staying alive, I was really impressed that you could get that many calories out of a single tree. Are walnuts the champion there, or is there another nut tree that does better than that?
So the champion is unfortunately extinct. It's functionally extinct. So the champion is the American chestnut tree. The entire eastern half of the US, the entire economy basically revolved around the chestnut tree. About 100 years ago, there was a blight that kind of wiped them out. And you can still get Chinese chestnut trees. But chestnuts roasting on a fire, that's because chestnuts were such prolific nuts. Basically, how most nut trees, at least in a temperate environment, not tropical, in a temperate environment, do a year of plenty and a year of not so much. And it's kind of sporadic. It might be 4 years of not so much, and then 1 year where they just dump a ridiculous amount of nuts. So this is all of your juglone family, especially. So that would be walnut, pecan, hickory. They do this so that way the predator population, the squirrels, don't explode and rely on the nuts every year. And so they have a little bit of nuts 1 year, a little bit of nuts the next year, and then they do a ridiculous amount of nuts 1 year. And so that way even though there's plenty of predators, lots of nuts get spread around. Whereas chestnuts do it consistently every single year. So you can get a reliable crop every single year. And the champion of the chestnuts was the American chestnut. This was the American overstory tree. It would grow to be, people know of the redwoods, those big giant trees out west. The American chestnut was not as big as the redwoods, but it was a massive tree. It's one of those trees where you could have like 50 people, 30 people surround it and not touch hands all the way. These trees were huge, and they would dump a ridiculous amount of nuts every single year. And so that's how the American Eastern pig and poultry populations were fed in the fall. They just fed them chestnuts all fall long, and they would fatten them up instead of off of grains. They would fatten them up off of chestnuts. So, unfortunately, about 100 years ago, Chinese chestnut trees have a blight. It's a disease, and that got infected into the American chestnuts, and it basically wiped them all out. There still are some American chestnuts, and we're actually really close as a society to breeding the American chestnut tree back into a viable option.
Nice.
But it's functionally extinct. You can't find it in the wild. Every once in a while you can find one in the wild, but it's not very often because the blight kills them. So what people have had to do instead is use Chinese chestnut trees. And Chinese chestnut trees or Chinese chestnut trees, European chestnut trees, Japanese chestnut trees. These are all related to each other, and they all have different pros and cons. But they're all a lot smaller than the American chestnut tree. They're all a typical orchard tree, which in a homestead aspect is pretty useful, just not as cool as the American chestnut tree. So that's what I would say.
Very
The
nice.
chestnut is probably what I would say is the champion of nut trees for production.
So, what are some pitfalls or some of the biggest mistakes that a landowner, trying to do what you're doing, trying to set up their own homestead or things like that? What are some of those pitfalls they can make with dealing with trees on their property? Either going into a property and clearing trees so they can build, or what trees they plant and how they space them and things like that. What's some advice there?
So, what I would say is actually the biggest pitfall is when you're first buying land, one of the things that people always seem to think that they need is good farmland. Farmland is a premium. It's going to be way more expensive. And as a homesteader, farmland is actually pretty bad because it's been stripped of all of its nutrients. And so you have to rebuild the farmland for a homestead application unless you personally want to have a tractor and to go out and spray and do all the things that the industrial side of farming requires. So people will go out and buy farmland that has no trees and no nutrients. What I would actually recommend if you're wanting to homestead or just be in a more self-reliant aspect is buy crappy hunting land. I have two different lots at this point, and both of them are I bought at a steal because this land is terrible. Nobody can build a house on this. It's way too hilly and there's trees everywhere. I'm like, well, that's kind of what I want. I want trees because trees are a lot easier to chop down than they are to wait 30 years to grow. And so I would much rather clear a few trees to make room for what I'm wanting to do than to start with an empty field and plant the trees and try and get them to grow. Because here's the thing, most homesteaders want animals. Most homesteaders also know that trees are pretty useful. Silvopasture is where you have animals and trees mixed together. If you want silvopasture and you're starting with pasture where there's no trees, you have to fence off those trees for at least 2 to 3 years so that way they're big enough so the animals don't eat them or crush them. Whereas if you start with a forest, you just have to chop down all the trees that you don't want, and then the grass will grow up. There's grass seeds pretty much everywhere, at least in the US. It'll just appear. Once you clear the foliage, grass will appear. You can also always just seed it, but grass will appear. And so it's a lot easier to start your silvopasture and integrate animals if you have established trees than trying to establish the trees in a pasture. So that's what I would say is the kind of the both of those things. Kind of the biggest thing is trying to pick clean, pretty grassland as how you're starting out, or a field, instead of rugged forest, because it's a lot easier to modify the land to what you're wanting to do.
Very nice. And I know you said in one of your shorts that there's a region of the U.S. that's kind of prime for homesteading, and you call it, I believe you called it your Zion region. Do you want to kind of go over what states are involved in that, like that
Yeah.
area?
So the Zion region, the term comes from early LDS roots. So in early American history, there was Latter-day Saint Mormon. And so Latter-day Saints moved to Missouri and they called that region Zion. And then they moved away for reasons. But that area just so happens to be the easiest place on the entire planet to be self-reliant. So the basic area is all of Missouri and then all the surrounding states around Missouri. So this is right where the Great Plains meet the Ozark Mountains. And so you get a lot of different attributes that come from being in that region. So Missouri, my property is in Oklahoma, and so that's just at the very bottom of it. But Missouri, Oklahoma, Arkansas, I'm actually spacing on all the names. Let me pull up.
It's all the unimportant one.
The Iowa, Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Tennessee, and Illinois, and Kentucky.
Yeah. Okay. So Missouri overall is the core of it. And then you don't want to go too far south because then it starts getting too hot. Some people prefer it to be too hot, but once you get into too hot of a region, you start dealing with extra pest problems, extra environmental problems, and so it just becomes more challenging to be self-reliant once you get too far south, including the fact that it's a whole lot easier to heat a home than it is to cool a home. So I'm actually about as far south as I would recommend because I don't like the cold. And so I'm pretty far south. You don't want to go too far west because things start to get a little too dry, and water is very important. Water is needed for survival, is the most important substance, and you can't do anything without water. So Missouri is completely included in the Zion region, but only the eastern half of Oklahoma, Kansas, and Nebraska are included. Because once you get out to the western half of those states, you are actually in a very dry region of the US, and it's just not as easy. You can homestead anywhere, but it's just not as easy. You don't want to go too far east simply because that's just where everybody lives. And so there's just too many people. And so land is really, really expensive. And so it's a nice area. You can homestead and be self reliant all across the eastern half of the US. It's one of the most hospitable regions in the world, but there's just too many people there. And then you don't want to go too far north for the exact reasons that you would suspect. Long winters, short growing seasons, lots of snow. It's just hard. That's why I actually don't recommend Alaska. The winters and lack of sunlight are just too hard for most people. And so
Gotcha.
that's kind of how those boundaries. I drew up the Zion region boundaries of what I call the Zion region. And that's my reasons behind where I stopped the boundaries. Illinois is actually mostly excluded due to laws, but that gets into the realm of politics, and we're not going to talk about that. But I excluded Illinois in my personal map because it makes it really a lot of regulations make it really hard to be self-reliant and homestead in Illinois. So that's kind of what the Zion region is. And due to my LDS roots, I just kind of like the name, and it just so happened to line up pretty close to the original Zion region that the Latter day Saints did back in the 1830s. And so I was like, all right, so that that works, and I'll just call it that. And so that's kind of where that term came about and how those borders came about.
Very cool.
That's really cool. That's interesting. I wanna shift gears a little bit because I there was one part of your book where you were throwing a little bit of shade on maple. I'm a big maple fan, but you were talking about how it's not just maple syrup, but there's tons of other trees that are sugary enough that you can get syrup from. So trees that could actually produce enough sugar. What are those other trees that people just don't think about? Because I think maple is just the big one. I blame Canadians, but
Well, maple is also a very abundant tree all throughout the American North. It's a very predominant tree. And so there's lots of maple trees for you to harvest. And specifically, I was throwing shade at sugar maple. So,
the other
sugar
maples
maple
are
is
all
where we
right.
get yeah, sugar maple is where we get most of our maple syrup. However, if you're a homesteader, red maple produces a very sugary sap. So how syrup is made is you tap a tree and you basically let the liquids in the tree drain out into a bucket. And then you boil that bucket to reduce the liquid, and then you're left with syrup. You're left with the sugary content of the tree, and you just evaporate the water. Sugar maples produce a very sugary sap that you can easily boil down into a syrup. Red maples produce a fairly sugary sap that takes a little bit more boiling. I want to say it's like you need for sugar maple 30 gallons to make 1 gallon of syrup. And then red maple, you need 40 gallons of sap to make 1 gallon of syrup. So it's a little less efficient. That's why industry they do the sugar maples, because at that scale the slight difference in efficiencies matters because you're using energy to heat this sap to make the syrup. So you need that 10-gallon difference is a big difference in your bottom line. As a homesteader, you're burning firewood or you're doing something to produce heat, probably for free or minor expense. And red maples grow way, way faster than sugar maples. And so if you don't have a maple tree and you want maple syrup, you can plant a red maple and it'll be ready to be harvested a lot quicker than a sugar maple would be. Maple trees are still perfectly good syrup making trees. Another good one I already mentioned would be mulberry. In fact, a lot of your fruit trees, if they're bigger fruit trees, will have pretty tasty syrup. So maple trees, and then pretty much a lot of your, pretty much any of your deciduous hardwood trees. So the trees that fall off in the fall. Any tree that has leaves that fall off in the fall will have sap in the spring that you can tap. And off of the top of my head, I can't list every single one that would be good. Black walnut is a particular favorite of a lot of people, and oak is not. Oak is a very bitter, gross sap. But black walnut, I believe birch,
I was
birch
gonna say
water.
birch. I've heard birch that people will use birch, but that sounds like kind of the Temu version of maple syrup or something.
Yeah. So I believe birch is a good one. I believe aspen is not a good one. I don't think walnut's a good one, but a lot of your fruit trees will be good. And if you want, so obviously look up to make sure that it's not poisonous first. But if you have some hardwood trees in your backyard, try tapping them and see if you like the flavor. Because just because in general most people don't like the flavor doesn't mean that you won't like the flavor. Don't do oak. Oak is gross. Pretty much everyone acknowledges oak is gross. But most hardwood trees can be tapped for their sap, and sap is generally pretty sugary. And so you're probably going, more often than not, you're probably going to end up with a syrup that tastes pretty decent.
That's interesting. I have a lot of broadleaf maple, and so I wanted to try it this year. Like I haven't done it yet, but I think in the spring when it's time, I guess it's right after the last frost is the perfect time to do it or something. But I want to tap them and try maple syrup. But yeah, I don't have any sugar maple, but we have a lot of broadleaf and we have a ton of vine maple, but a lot of broadleaf maple. So I was gonna try those and yeah, see what I thought about it because I'd never done it.
I'm gonna go out into the front yard and try tasting the pin oak that's out there.
Yeah. Now I just want to try oak syrup. I don't just
So oak trees are very high in tannins, and tannin and tanning sound very similar because you use tannins to tan things. So tannins are gross and very bitter. And that's why we don't typically eat acorns. You can eat acorns. That's another survival tree that you can harvest. You just have to leach the tannins out with water, and then that brown liquid that comes out of the acorns you can use to tan leather. But it's does not taste good. It's very very bitter, and so that's why I was like, don't oak.
That's cool that you can use it to tan leather, though.
I didn't know that. I didn't know that that's you could use tannins like out of the because I've heard people obviously leaching the acorns. I didn't know that you could actually use that wastewater for something else. That's actually a really cool hack.
Yeah, so there's lots of trees that they would either, like for instance, oak, that they would use the acorns to create tanning juice where they leach out the tannins. And a lot of trees they would harvest the bark. I want to say hemlock. I want to say hemlock was is a pretty overall not that useful of a tree, but the bark is extreme. I want to, and I don't remember if it's hemlock, but I want to say it is hemlock. The bark is extremely high in tannins. So early frontiersmen homesteaders would literally just strip the bark as high as they could reach all the way around the tree and use that to create their tanning liquid for tanning hides. And they would just strip the tree of its bark because it was really high in tannins.
That's really cool. That's impressive. I like that. I'm gonna have to try to find some high tannin stuff to make my own tanning juice for the next time I go hunting.
Yeah. So yeah, that's where we got the word tanning is from tannins.
Interesting. So shifting gears a little bit here from kind of a wildfire risk perspective, what should every homeowner be looking at around their property as far as trees and foliage and everything
Yeah, there
that
are there
goes into
trees
it?
you want closer to the house and further away from the house, assuming that everything's cleared appropriately. What are the fire resistant trees that you would like closer rather than further away?
So I can tell you a tree that you do not want is near your house is eucalyptus. It's a very prolific tree, invasive tree out west that is very high in oils. You basically don't want any tree that is very high in oils because oil burns really well.
Makes
And
sense.
so on that same note, you typically don't want a lot of evergreen shrubs. So evergreen trees, that's not as big of an issue. It can be an issue because evergreen trees have a lot of oil in them. They're very sappy trees. So those can be a danger to your house, but not as big of a danger as evergreen shrubbery. A lot of your so evergreen is just means that it lasts through the winter and it stays green all winter long. A lot of your hedges, like a lot of people like to put it in their yards, are very oily evergreen shrubs that burn really easy. There are a couple of exceptions, like for instance, camellia is a flower bush and camellias look a lot like roses, but they bloom in January. They also don't grow very far north, but they're an evergreen shrub that isn't super oily, so that one would be fine. In general, you want hardwood trees and you want to clear as much of the ground layer as possible around your house. So, for me in particular, I mentioned the camellias because I actually plan on putting those around my house. That's not for fire reasons, that's because they're pretty. So sometimes you have to do pros and cons of what you're wanting to do. However, at the same time, I am also actively clearing any little saplings that are near my house to try and create basically a fire bandwidth that hopefully will not burn my house down. And the bigger you can clear, the farther away that you can clear that ground layer from your house, the safer your house will be. But there's some more things to consider than just fire. Like, for instance, the pretty beautification of your house, or the utility of your land, because not everybody has a ton of land. And so you want to have at least a little bit of space between you and burnable stuff, but you also want to be able to produce food and livestock. And so there's just kind of a tug of war that happens there where how far do you want to put it out? And I would recommend at least a 10-foot perimeter would be more than plenty, where you just clear. That's what lawns are for. I know lawns are, especially in the hippy dippy side of prepper or homesteader, lawns are the devil and are
Sure.
shouldn't be a thing. But no, lawns are a fire precaution. You put lawns down because they don't burn, and they're kind of nice for kids. But you don't want any woody, burnable, oily things near your house. That said, back to the utility side, I have a lot of pine trees and a lot of other trees that are very close to my house. And that's because I want to utilize the shade aspect. Um, I did purposely make sure to cut. So I was very particular about where I put my house, and I cut down plenty of trees to make room for my house because I'm in a very heavily forested area. But I did make sure to put the pine trees at least 5 feet away, I think is the closest one of my pine trees is. And for the oak trees, which have big, heavy branches that could fall on your house and ruin things, it's kind of expensive when a tree falls on your house. I made sure that the oak trees were leaning away from the house, that the way the tree is naturally positioned, it's already naturally leaning away. And I cut down the trees that were leaning towards the house. So if anything happens and the tree dies and falls over, most likely, there's never a perfect guarantee, especially when it comes to trees breaking and throwing things everywhere. But most likely, those trees will fall away. But I wanted to keep some trees nearby because I wanted that shade. Because again, cooling a house is very difficult. And so anything that you can do to help minimize that air conditioning load on your house is very useful. I can go on to that tangent as well, but that's why my house is white. And so there's a lot of little things that you can do to try and keep your house cool. Because if you're off grid, power is a premium. And so
Sure.
if you there's just a couple little tweaks you can do, like for instance having a shade tree cover your roof, then that's useful. So that's
Interesting.
kind of the fire management spiel for
So so I
foliage.
want to ask, is there what's the one tree that the world could do without? If you said, I hate this tree and we don't need any of that tree, what's like the anchovies or nickelback of trees?
I have to think about that one for a second. Off the top of my head, sycamore.
Really?
So sycamore rots from the inside out. doesn't have any good uses, and it's just a big, obnoxious tree that is not very stable. And that's just off the top of my head. I'm sure I could think of one that I really hate, but that one's just a useless tree. And so I'm like, yeah,
Not a
then we
lot of
don't need that tree.
utility for a
Yeah.
sycamore. We're not building anything out of sycamore, anything like that.
I'm just glad it wasn't my favorite tree, which is willows. I'm a big
So I
fan of
actually really
willows.
love willows.
Now,
Willows are an
willow and
extremely useful tree.
aspen is a willow, isn't it, of the willow family?
They're in the same family, but they have a lot of different uses. So cottonwood is also in that same family.
Oh, okay.
But so aspen trees are one of my favorites because they're pretty in the fall, but you can use the bark as sunscreen. The aspen tree is a very dusty tree, and if you rub your hand on the bark of the tree and then rub that dust all over your skin, it's a natural sunscreen and was used historically to prevent burns. And I've used it on multiple occasions to prevent burns when I was out somewhere and I was like, I'm starting to burn and I don't have sunscreen. There's an aspen tree. Let me rub it real quick and put it on my skin. And you just
Very
look a
nice.
little gray. Willow
That's
trees,
interesting.
willow bark, so that Cambion layer where I talked about with the pine that you can eat, willow bark is a natural painkiller. Aspartame is how we originally derived aspirin. So willow bark, you can boil it in a tea and basically make a homemade aspirin. Now, we do a lot of things to chemically stabilize aspirin, so I would actually say buying painkillers is a better idea. It's a little less harsh on your stomach, but in a pinch, you can make aspen tea bark as a painkiller, and it'll work like aspirin. Also, aspen leaves are full of rooting hormone. So the cool thing about aspens, if you take a branch and just stick it in the ground, there's a good chance that that branch will become a tree. Those leaves are so full of rooting hormone that if you soak those leaves in water, and then stick other tree branches in that water, you dramatically increase the chances that those branches will start producing roots. That's actually how we clone trees. That's how you get the same variety of fruit as you clone a tree by taking a branch and attaching it to a rootstock, and then you get a exact copy of the original tree. For non-fruit trees, like for instance woody trees, like for instance aspens, if you stick them in rooting hormone from you can just cut a branch off and stick it in rooting hormone, there's a good chance that those trees, that branch will start producing roots that you can then go and plant, and that's how you can propagate lots of your woody trees easily and quickly. So I really like both
Interesting.
aspen and willow.
That's awesome. I feel like we've barely scratched the surface when it comes to like all of the cool tree stuff you talk about. So where can people like find your book? Where would you like people to go learn more about your stuff and specifically your cool new book? Where's the best place to pick that up?
So the book is exclusively available on Amazon. I went with the self-publishing route that Amazon provides, and you just can go to Amazon and look up Useful Trees by Nathan Dickinson, and it'll pop right up pretty easily. Or you can go to my social medias, and my social media is always just Nathan Dickinson, Nathan, and it's just at Nathan Dickinson. And those are my social medias. I'm on Instagram, I'm on TikTok and YouTube, and those are my three main ones that I do. I'm also on Facebook. And so you can just go find me on social media. And if you want the book through that route, you can just click on the link in my bio on my social media and it'll take you right to the Amazon page. And the book is currently available in both paperback, hard copy, and then I think the ebook is actually having some issues right now and is offline. But the paperback and hard copy or hardcover is the word I'm looking for, are available. And I'm actually currently working on a audiobook version of it, so that will be out eventually, hopefully soon.
That's awesome. Yeah, we actually really appreciate you coming on because I've learned a lot and I feel like now I need to go buy the book and like learn all the other stuff.
Right?
Before we let you go, do you have any questions for us?
No, but thank you for having me on. It was really fun to come on and talk about prepping stuff with you guys.
Yeah, an
Yeah,
hour just flies by. I feel like we're gonna have you back on because I feel like we didn't even really scratch the surface on this. I just learned so much stuff.
yeah, this was amazing. I learned a ton from firewood and which trees to go for and which ones are gonna look best in the backyard and which ones are gonna actually feed me,
Sycamore, stupid, stupid sycamore.
right? There's a willow tree down the street that I'm gonna have to go hack some branches off of. Just don't tell the
Yeah.
neighbors or the HOA. Well, Nathan, like AC said, we're super, super glad that you came on, and thank you again for engaging with our listeners. And for our listeners, remember that preparedness isn't just bug out bags and gadgets. Sometimes resilience is literally growing in your own backyard. So be sure to tune in next week. Again, completely new direction like always, but we will see you then. And remember, you are your own stakeholder.